Can you remember a time that you were part of leading worship when just things completely went off the rails?
The only moment that was not embarrassing, but it was kind of a train wreck, I won't name the guitar player. We led into a song, and everybody's in the right key except the guitar player. And he's playing the lead into my vocal.
Oh.
He is like he's in A and they're in G.
But because he's playing first, it's going to sound like he's right.
Right.
And everything else is wrong.
And I still came in G. And luckily, after one measure, they got his attention.
Well, when that happened with me, there was a song called Redeemer. Mm-hmm. That was the song that we were doing after the sermon. Well, my small group was meeting, and I had my pack with me, and I could put my in-ear and hear, I could turn it on and hear the sermon. And so I just get into the discussion. I turn my pack on, and the music for the song is playing. There's no direct line to get there. I had to run down this long breezeway, then run down the nursery hallway, enter the code to get in the backstage door. I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And I was on piano that day. Well, in that arrangement of the song, the piano didn't come in until the bridge. And I'm like, this is the chorus before the bridge. And so the piano was set up right inside the curtain. So I slipped in, sat down, and there's 2, 3, 4, and then my hands went down. So it's like exactly like I planned it.
You gave it, right as you slipped on stage, you gave kind of a wave to everybody. How y'all doing?
Welcome to What We Really Want, conversations about connection. Settle in and get ready for a great conversation. Let's talk about what we really want.
Hey friends, welcome back to What We Really Want. This is episode 27. It's called Windows of Hope. My guest today is a good friend for many years. His name is David Graves, and David is a photographer who has just recently released a book called Alabama Faith, and it is a collection of beautiful pictures of stained glass windows from churches all around the state of Alabama. I sat down with David a couple of weeks ago to talk about the book, to talk about our friendship, to talk about grace and hope and second chances and family and church and just a whole lot of other great things. I hope you enjoy this conversation. It sure was great for me to get to catch up with a friend I don't get to see very much anymore. This is someone who showed me a lot of grace and love in a time that I needed it, and I've had chances over the years to return the favor, and just was a really sweet time to get to sit down and reminisce. Also want to take a few minutes to thank you for listening to this podcast. We started back in April, and here we are wrapping up 2024. We can't wait for 2025. We're growing, and we hope that you'll help with that by telling all of your friends and family about the show. But for now, enjoy your New Year's Eve listening to me catching up with a good friend talking about faith, hope, and stained glass windows. Here's episode 27 with David Graves, Windows of Hope. That's awesome. Hilarious thing is I profusely apologized afterwards. He says, man, you shouldn't have told me. I had no idea you weren't there.
And that's the case in most things. When we go, hey, this happened, people go, I had no idea.
David Graves, my buddy, welcome to What We Really Want.
Dude, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here to spend time with you.
Well, I'm loving it just because we've been friends for a really long time. And yet we haven't really kept up lately.
No. We've known each other since 2008, 2009, right
2009. Yeah.
15
Well,
years.
I know that we met just in the aftermath of my life blowing up, and that was early 2009.
Right.
Yeah.
And mine too.
So this is great. This is a long time coming. And we've got a great reason for having a conversation today. You got a book that is just blowing up. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. We're going to talk about Alabama Faith, churches and stained glass. But I'm just really looking forward to catching up with my friends. So let me ask you, David, what do you really want out of our conversation?
One, I'm so honored that we're doing this together. It's to be able to talk to a friend, these other interviews and everything else, great. But to have this discussion with a friend takes a totally different angle. I would love for the theme today to be about hope and the fact that nobody is beyond redemption. That's what this project talks about. That's what our lives talk about. And I think that's a great place for us to encourage people who listen to the podcast.
I'm going to say this just in case this comes through in anything that we use. We're recording this in our new offices, and it's in a building where there's still construction going on. And one floor beneath us, somebody is sounds like they're sawing through either concrete or some kind of metal. So if you hear that from time to time, that's what it is. Before we get to the book, in the interest of what we're about on this podcast of making connections, like help us connect with you. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town, Thomasville, Alabama, a town of less than 2,000. Kind of a chaotic home at times. Dad was a workaholic. Mom dealt with some depression. Have 3 siblings, older brother, older sister. She didn't like me to say older sister. Fraternal twin brother. By God's grace, all 4, we're close to each other, which is the more and more I talk to people, it seems to be unique to be close to your siblings. I'm so grateful for that. Went off to college, University of Mobile, was fortunate to sing for the university and travel. And that led me to tour for an additional year after college. From a faith standpoint, which is what the book is rooted in, my life growing up, didn't know I could ask questions and didn't know who to ask questions to. So I kind of developed an early understanding of the stories of the gospel, but I would say I had a very toxic image of what the gospel was, which was a credit-debit relationship. If I do these good things for the Lord, then when I do these bad things, it balances out. And the reality that I know later in life is that it never equals to 0, right? And so for the longest time, and I've been so fortunate, I have college friends I've known for 30 years. There's a group of 10 guys that we get together the last 12 years. We're called House 12. We actually buried one of our House 12 mates this year. It was 45 years old, which was eye-opening.
Wow.
That group of guys, we have one lost a mother, 5 of us have lost our fathers. We've walked through seasons of life together, but even in them, in the early days of getting back together, I expressed a lot of not regret, but remorse of, I wish I had grown up sooner and been more mature in college. The book has brought spotlights back to the University of Mobile, and I've been able to say to so many people in person, I'm so sorry for my immaturity and the toxic view that I had, because you had to live in the wake of those things. And even in Birmingham, people have had to do that. Until the Lord, by His grace, radically exposed my life being a double life. And because of that, I came to understand that there's nothing I can do on my own merit. I am undeserving. And the only thing I can do is believe what the Bible says about who God is and who I am. And I can even pull back to a conversation we had a couple of years ago, and I love the great reminder you had, which is being fully known allows you to walk in freedom. And whatever that 3% that's not known is the 3% that needs to be known, so you
the
can
most in that moment,
right, that you can be set free. And as it transitions, about 7 years ago, a friend of mine, also a farmer rep, but went to church together, sang on praise team. We happened to be in the same location, Knoxville, Tennessee, and we met at a place to have lunch. And I'll never forget that day. He said to me, he goes, "You work really hard and you're good at your job, but your life is out of balance. You don't know how to rest." Now, I have this tradition. Every Sunday, my phone is on silent, and from 1 to 3 o'clock, I am resting. May not be asleep, but I'm not answering texts. And people say, my fraternal twin will say, "Well, what if Jesus comes back?" And I said, "Well, He'll wake me up." But I really, on my tombstone, I would like it to say no visitors between 1 and 3 on Sunday.
Jesus knows I'd prefer He wait until 3:01.
That's right. I mean, even if I have a tombstone, just no visitors between 1 and 3. I want to keep that tradition going. So, but I knew how to do that, but not how to actually, my value was so much into my job. And this friend was so gracious to point out a blind spot. And that's when I started to make a bucket list and knew I wanted to travel. Iceland, Ireland, Scotland, all these places. And when that happened, I said, man, I'd really like to be able to document the things that I see well. And I began to be self-taught in photography. Now, one of the things I'll say, and the big lessons there is, you cannot become great at something unless you're willing to be bad at it first. That's true in our spiritual walk. That's true in Celebrate Recovery. That's true in whatever passions we have. Unless you're willing to be bad at something first, I'll even say public prayer or, men praying in small group. unless you're willing to be bad at something first, you're never going to grow into whatever that may be. And so 7 years ago, started to really practice photography, make a lot of mistakes, not treat it as shameful mistakes, but just I'm learning.
You know, that's a really important thing that you said.
Right.
Sometimes important things, we can glaze over them and think, well, sure, of course. But, you know, you think about somebody who's a musical virtuoso, and it's not like, oh, well, that person must have just been a prodigy. They could do that without even trying. No, that's like, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, 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 you know? And at first, most people were just horrendous. You've got this vision of what you want. And so what do you think keeps people from shouldering through being bad and sticking with something to the point of becoming good?
I would say one of the biggest things is social media, because we have lost our ability to slow down. All we do is compare the chaos of our lives to the highlight of somebody else's life. When people look at, for example, my photography this morning, I'll give you the example. Oh my goodness, David, that sunrise picture you took at King's Chair this morning was amazing. One, it's a moment in time capturing God's glory to the believer and unbeliever. That's part of my philosophy. But I would say to those people, you got to be there when sunrise happens. Number two, that I had to wake up at 4:50, drive through the gate at 5:30, hike for 35 minutes in 21-degree weather, and then sit there for 15 minutes waiting for that moment. That's what I had to do. So a lot of times when people will applaud you for your success, they don't peek behind the curtain to see everything it takes to get to that moment. I have taken over the last 3 years, which is when my photography really began to take off and get noticed, and whether people were sharing it or some other things, is that I have taken over 15,000 pictures in the last 7 years. Just for the book, 600 pictures, 100 churches. What people don't see is I'll go out today and I'll spend an hour taking pictures this afternoon, or studying, or looking at somebody else's work for inspiration. And that's something that has no creative outlet. It is just me putting in time to be better at my craft. That's what I would encourage people to do, is don't compare your day 27 to somebody's year 4. And so if you want to be great at something, be willing to put in the work.
So we're talking about patience.
Sure.
And an old school biblical word is long suffering.
Yeah.
Right? Because I'm thinking even about your King's Chair example. If the focus is, 450, man, I got to drive 35 minutes. Dadgum, it's 21 degrees outside.
Right.
So many things that are obstacles to the goal, like obstacles to the eventual beauty.
Right.
But you have to overcome 1, 2, 3, 4 hurdles, and now you're there. Then when the sunrise comes up, it's like, oh, this is why I got up at 4:50 and I drove 35 minutes and I bundled up to walk.
If you fall in love with the art of discipline, it's not that you don't enjoy waking up at 5 a.m. and running 12 miles necessarily, but being in love with the discipline of the benefits from it, but also the fact that you're giving yourself a gift. So nobody can advocate. Sometimes you have to advocate for yourself internally. And one of the things I think about is I'm giving myself the gift of discipline. I'm planting a seed here, which is there are people who can never experience this King's Chair sunrise. They'll never make it up there. They don't get private access to the park that I'm very fortunate to have. So I do this for the benefit of other people, but it's also a gift to myself to remember when things get hard, let me reflect back on hard things that I've done, and I've given myself the gift of perseverance. Last year, it happened to be hiking out there at Oak Mountain when they did the Mammoth March, the 20-mile march, and I was asked to kind of lead some people. And at mile 15, a couple people wanted to drop out, and they just said, hey, we think we're going to catch the shuttle back. And I said, okay, here's the deal. Leaving in 3 minutes, I just want to give you this one encouragement. You're going to give yourself a gift one of two ways. One, if you drop out, you're giving yourself the gift moving forward that when things get hard, you can just take the exit. Or you can persevere for another 5 miles and you can give yourself the gift of, I can do hard things.
Yeah.
One of the two. So that's what I would say to people who are starting something out, whether it's a new hobby or whether it's a new passion.
Or walking through a tough time in their lives.
Absolutely.
What you're describing is so applicable across the board.
Absolutely.
What you just said in the last 30 seconds is very congruent with things that I say all the time to people in recovery about making choices, making decisions for your life, and then as an adult, accepting everything that comes with that decision.
Right.
And it can be from something as menial or trivial as like, what am I going to choose to eat, to how am I going to show up in this relationship? It's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And one of the first things whenever, if a guy comes to me and says, hey, I'm having this trouble or this, that, whatever it may be, my first questions are this: where are you involved in church? What small group are you in? How often do you open God's Word? So there's a study out there that says of self-professed Christians that about 35% open their Bible once a week, which is on Sunday. Another 30%, it's less than 3 times a week, and only about 25% open their Bible more than 3 times a week. Some of the heartache that we experience is simply because we have not advocated and given ourselves the gift of some of these easy disciplines that could make our life a little more simple. Opening God's Word, understanding who He is, who He says we are, those type of things.
And you're nurturing that connection with God.
Amen.
And I was thinking as you were describing the King's Chair example, in doing that, you're nurturing connection with God, seeing His creation. You're nurturing connection with yourself because of what you experience, your sensory, your spiritual experience as you're doing everything that you have to do to get that shot or those shots. And you're connecting with other people.
Right.
Because like you said, there are some people who will never be able to make that hike and see it first person. But when they look at your beautiful photos, they get a sense of that. And connection is the whole reason we do this podcast.
Right.
And the 3 main connections we talk about are with God, with ourselves, with other people. And there are those things where if we will slow down and see the greater value, then sometimes we get all 3.
Right. Slowing down is another theme of the book. We have lost societally, I would comment and say, I think we've lost our ability to be in awe of things, because it could be parents who listen to this podcast who run from event to event, children from this, that, and the other, and there's never a moment, or there are a few moments of reflection or being in awe of anything. Life is just too busy.
Yeah.
When I take these sunrise pictures, one, it's God's new mercy every day. That's the overwhelming sense that I get most every day when I take this picture. This is new mercy coming over the horizon to greet me. No sunrise is the same. I have zero expectation, and when it greets me, especially this time of year, it is just, I'm in awe of that. Also, as we talk about the book later, I would find myself standing in the back of these sanctuaries, not rushing to take the picture. Again, this is that discipline, but just taking in, what am I looking at? Every room is different. Everyone has its own characteristics, but the one thing that was common is you think about hope in 2 ways. You think about reflective hope. That light reflects all the lives through centuries who have been changed as a result of the story these windows tell. And to stand there and just begin to fathom whatever, if you're listening to this podcast, whatever church you go to, my encouragement to you, upcoming Sunday, get there 5 minutes early, stand in the back of the room, and I want you to just think, even if you don't have stained glass, just think about the lives you know that have been changed in that room because of the story of hope. That's a reflective hope. And then we have an anticipation hope, which says there's a life that's going to be changed today. There's a life that's going to be changed next week, 2 weeks from now. People are going to be set free. You and I have a very unique perspective in that, helping to lead worship. We've already prepared to lead vocally in the worship. We have this emotional connection to what we're singing.
Yeah.
And also as part of that, we look out and we can see all these stories. There's a widow sitting on the left-hand side who, hands thrown up, 2 weeks after her husband passed away 10 years ago. as our eyes scan and we see these things. So we're seeing these stories that have happened, but these stories are going to continue to happen. Not only do we have reflective hope, but we have an anticipatory hope, which if we will pause and reflect on that, it will light this fire in our soul. When I take pictures, if you were there, I wouldn't hear you speak just because my mind gets so dialed into what I'm doing. But it sets my soul on fire to capture a moment of God's grace for whomever, because I don't have an expectation of how it's going to be used. But then just like with the book, let the Lord use it how he wants to use it. And then it gets multiplied way more than I could have ever would have imagined. But it's because of that slow down, reflect, let's go here, let's capture this, and then just be done with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about the perspective, and the example you used was being up on that platform,
right,
and the preparation and looking out and seeing just everything you were just talking about. You and I also share a perspective of having gone through seasons where everything was turned upside down.
Absolutely.
Everything was. I mean, we were sitting in a metaphorical crater,
right,
having had a lot of harm done to us, but also having done a lot of harm.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, I think about when you and I met in 2009, I had hope.
Right.
But because my secret was out and I had begun to experience recovery. So I had hope, but it was a very raw, unspecified, undefined hope,
right,
of what was still going to happen. And now, sitting here almost 16 years later, no less hope. Now it's hope that can look back and say, yep, and that happened that I didn't know was going to happen. And that happened that I didn't know was going to happen. And now we have the benefit of time,
right,
you know, and of being the age that we are, of having not only survived something devastating, but also like seeing that this was not ever something that was out of God's plan for our story.
Yeah. And you don't know this part is part of us catching up, which is when the book came out and began to get reviews and different people were picking up the story. Eventually, one day I get a message from Mary at AL.com. And we had interacted before because of a picture of Bruce Willis and I. But Mary sent me a message that said, hey, would you want to do an article with AL.com, which was one of the big goals in promoting the book. And when she reached out, I thought, yes, let's do this. I'm so thankful. Other things happened to kind of prepare me for that interview. But she sent me a message and, hey, let's try and figure out a time. Didn't think much of it. And I said, how about Thursday, 1:00? Made sure we had the same location. That morning, I woke up getting prepared for the interview. One of my things I do after my morning time in the Word, I just look over on Facebook memories. 15 years ago to the day.
No, come on.
That my world publicly fell apart. It was 15 years ago to the day that I would sit down with AL.com to tell this story about hope and redemption and just how the Lord has been gracious to us and be able to speak with great confidence that no one is beyond redemption.
So it makes a little bit more sense.
Right.
Why, when you talk about a book, basically a coffee table book,
absolutely,
filled with pictures of stained glass windows from churches in the state of Alabama, you would say the colors, the pews, and the light shining through the stained glass tell a universal story. Week after week, generation after generation, a message of hope resonates. People have walked through these doors weary, hopeless, and tired, only to be met with grace, hope, and love.
Absolutely.
So tell me about what it was like undertaking a project like this. I mean, when you started, did you have a charted out idea of the scale and the scope of where this was going?
I didn't initially. So I told the story of kind of the genesis of the book many years ago. I was 10 to 12 years old, small church, less than 200. I think it has to be. Is this
the Christmas Day story?
It had to be Christmas Eve. Now, the more I've spent time thinking about it, and that Sunday morning, the pastor just said, hey, we're not going to have service tonight. Spend time with your family. And can you imagine the needle on a record just kind of, yeah, it was that sound right there. So I'm sure there were some men who kind of set up like, wait, what? That's not tradition. And my dad being one of those people, we only lived maybe 150 yards from the church, and we could walk to the church, which we did. And he had a key, and he unlocked the door on Sunday night. We went in there, sat on the front row, and he had one brother read the Christmas story, another brother pray, and then he said to me, sing. and I stood up and sang Silent Night. And I even remember in that moment that this is something special, seeing that light reflect on the pews. As I told that story a couple of years ago, a friend says, hey, you should take pictures of stained glass windows in part of your territory. So February 23rd, I was in Portland, Maine as my birthday trip that year. And 2 days later, I'm driving to Gunnersville. On my way to Gunnersville, I go to turn right and I see Palmerdale Methodist Church, which was its name at the time. I think it's the third church in the book. I turn left. My camera stays in the car. I stay camera ready. The only difference now is I keep a lock on it. Now that people know my camera stays in the car, there's a TSA lock on there, so it's not readily available to anybody. I pulled in there and just
Please
said,
don't steal David's camera.
Yeah, please don't. And I said, hey, I'm a photographer. I'd love to take pictures of stained glass. And she said, would you like me to turn on the lights? I said, please don't. And I took the pictures at Palmerdale. And when I took those pictures, I thought, I want to set out a chart to go around the state and document this. And from my pharmaceutical background to kind of map it out, I began to do some research, who had stained glass and those type of things. And I just began to make phone calls and ask, hey, this is what I'm doing, and in exchange. And what I did for these churches too, I gifted those pictures back to the churches as a thank you, not giving away my copyright, but saying you could use these photos in any way you would like, whether it be print, social media, Facebook, et cetera, which was my way of saying thank you to them. And every church in this whole process, I only had 2 churches say no. One was because it was basically a cold call. I showed up that day. I happened to be in town taking pictures of the churches and said, hey, and the person responsible said we wouldn't be interested. And another church, I was in town taking pictures at churches. I already talked to them on the phone. Come by. Yeah, we got to check with somebody else. And the next time I called, they said, yeah, we have no interest. Ironically, the book comes out, starts being talked about, and that second church, who I'd talked to twice, called and said, hey, if you do another book, we would be interested. And I'd be honored to include you. You have amazing windows because you have a story to tell too. So it took 8 months because I didn't want to rush. I had no deadline. But the hardest part was the following 6 months. So I sat with these 600 photos. Here was some of my goals with the photos. And the reason I edited all 600, there's going to be a photo in this book that is going to spark a memory of faith for somebody. It's going to spark a conversation. My goal is for them to have that conversation with somebody else. We talked earlier about people have lost their sense of awe and slowing down. We've also lost the gift of talking about our faith with other people and those moments of faith. I never knew how my dad came to know Christ. And it was my dad's funeral. The day before his funeral, I asked my aunt, how did he come to faith? And she lit up and she said, oh, he loved to fight and he loved to drink when he came home from the Marines. And every Sunday I was going to church, I would go to his room and say, oh, Marvin, please go to church with me. No. And she said, one day I asked him and he said no. And so I went to close the door. He said, give me just a moment. Got dressed and went with her. She didn't see him at church. Somehow they separated. She comes home, and the first thing he said when he came through the door, he said, Elaine, I heard him call me. And she said, his life was different. And that was such a gift for her to be able to share with us. Again, we've lost that story. I made sure intentionally there's a few blank pages in the back of the book. So if somebody buys the book, whether you're giving as a gift or keeping it, write down some story of your faith or some landmarks in your faith so that at the right time, you can share that with the right person to encourage their faith. The funny thing is, there's 3 or 4 pictures in here that are my favorite. My sister said, you can't have that many favorites. I said, well, if you take 600 pictures, you can. Yeah. Typically, the ones that are my favorite, very few people resound with.
Why do you think that is?
One, it was I'm laying on my back in one of the pictures capturing this that just is not normally seen by the human eye. Your eyes aren't naturally attracted to one of these images. The other 2, they just bring back great memories in my life. One of college and then another when my life was transformed. And so that's why they resound with me. I have a friend who grew up in North Carolina. As he's looking through these pictures in Alabama, so grateful. He sent me a text and said, hey, this reminds me of my church in North Carolina. And I'm thinking, amen. So glad. That's the goal. this is a historical document. So whatever, some of these churches, they've even changed names since the book's come out. It is also a document for comfort and peace that people can look through and remember a different season of their life, and they can be renewed to talk about that. And lastly, it should be a conversation piece about faith. What is this that sets your soul on fire? And I thought about this morning as I was hiking and knowing we were going to talk. So it's not a blind spot because I'm aware of it, but from doing all of this, sometimes I find myself getting bored with people. I'm okay. I'm okay doing surface conversation time to time.
Yeah.
But if eventually we don't get to what sets your soul on fire, and I don't see a spark, I really can't do small talk for the long term.
In perpetuity.
Right.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to have a conversation, it doesn't matter what it is that sets your soul on fire. I can see it in your face as you start to talk passionately about those things. And so, that's my goal with the book. People can look at it historically. They can look at it as a place of comfort, but I really want them to use it as a discipline to talk about their faith with somebody else, to say, hey, this reminds me of a time when ...
So getting ready to wrap up this conversation, which has been so great. Thanks for just not only talking about the book, but everything that's been building really through life, things that we're doing that mean something. It's never isolated to just what's happening in this current season.
Right.
Every experience builds upon previous things. A few weeks ago, we had Mike Donahue from 10th Avenue North on the podcast.
Right.
And he was making a point about community. And he said, he quoted from the book and the movie Into the Wild, where the quote was, happiness is only real when it's shared. I'm thinking about that when I think about something you said several minutes ago about the challenge for people to show up at church 5 minutes early.
Right.
A thought I had before you got here today was many people will say it doesn't matter where you worship, right? Like the building doesn't really matter. Like that's, God is not bound by buildings. And I agree.
Sure.
That's true. There's definitely some truth there. But spending time in these buildings, and the purpose that you were there specifically for this book was to shoot these windows.
Right.
You also mentioned that we've lost our sense of awe.
Yeah.
So not only awe at the beauty of these broken pieces of glass that when you put them together make something beautiful, but like, hey, what does that remind us of?
Right.
What else is going on in this room?
Right.
Broken people that are coming together to make something beautiful.
Absolutely.
But thinking about all the lives that have been changed in the room, what is it about the shared experience and the shared location that feels so special to you?
I think it's the fact it rubs up against in the correct way our sense of entitlement. So often I can get caught up in what's happening in my world and everything that I'm experiencing and forget that I am a dot in a kaleidoscope story that is throughout the arc of history.
Yeah.
Right. And when we talk about losing the sense of awe, I think we've also lost our sense of empathy. And when we disconnect from our own failure, our own redemption, our own story where we've been pulled from the pit, I tend to look down my nose at people who are struggling as if, why can't you get it together? Because I forget my own story and in my own brokenness, and that an arm reached down into a deep, deep pit to rescue me, that it was God's kindness that led to repentance. And when we tell stories of faith and are encouraged and we talk about our story, we begin to reconnect. So when we see that story on the news of whatever happened, we don't think, how could they do this? We think, that's what it looks like not to have hope. We get outraged as believers. We see it. And sure, we should call out injustice, evil, all these things. But I come back to the question, what do you expect people without hope to do? And when we tell the truth of who God is and who we are, and in the context of our story, this overwhelming sense of empathy toward another person who is broken, who is on the journey of healing, who is walking tough roads, it allows us to walk next to them and say, yeah, nobody's beyond redemption.
Yeah, can't say anything better than that. That's a great way to close this out. Yeah. David, thank you so much. Happy New Year. Yeah, so great to reconnect with you.
Family, yeah.
And I can't wait for more people to get a hold of Alabama Faith and Yeah, just to be inspired by beauty.
It's available on Amazon. Check with your local bookstore. They may have it. If not, they can get it.
Thanks so much, David.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man. It's great to catch up with you.
We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, feedback, topics you'd like to hear us talk about on the show, click the Send Us a Message link in the show notes of any episode.